I know I'm biased, but I think the most exciting medium to use is watercolor. You can do some fabulous things with it that you can't do with other mediums. In this video, I'll share 9 things you can do with a wet wash that will make your watercolor paintings stand out from the crowd. Charging is one of my favorite watercolor techniques, and it's really easy to do. You use this technique when you want to mix colors on the paper rather than the palette. I get my colors ready before I start painting. And then with my paper flat on the table, I wet it with some water. Then while that's wet, I paint on the main color. Here I'm just using French ultramarine. And then while that's wet, I drop in my next color. So here I'm using Windsor Violet. The colors will blend together and I try not to fuss with them too much with my brush. Here on a rabbit painting that I did a few years ago, I've wet the tummy area and I've just painted on a sort of a blue-green wash that I mixed. While that was wet, I dropped in some violet. I lifted my board and I let the colours merge together by themselves. It's best not to fuss with them too much. And here it is after it had dried. I've done the same thing up here on the neck area, although there I've dropped in a watercolour bloom as well to create some texture. You can sprinkle salt onto a wet wash to create beautiful organic shapes. You can use fine table salt or coarse. It doesn't matter. If you use coarse salt, the shapes you create will be larger than if you use fine salt. I have a little bit of difficulty with this technique because I often get the timing wrong. If you put the salt onto the wet wash while it's really wet, it doesn't have much of an effect. And if you put it on too late, again, it doesn't really do anything. Finding that sweet spot is the difficult part. This time I'll paint on dry paper. I've got some Windsor Violet. I'm painting it on fairly dark because I thought you'd be able to see the effect of the salt better if I do that. I'm just going to use some ordinary sea salt. This is coarse sea salt. And I'll place that onto the wet wash. Once I've got the salt on there, I have to let it sit and dry. And here I've got it on time lapse and you can see how the salt is creating those shapes in the wet wash. When it's dry, you brush the salt off and that's what you're left with. You can see down the bottom, I've got some larger shapes there because I think the wash was a bit wetter at the bottom when I put the salt on. An artist who uses salt effectively in his paintings is Karl Martens. He paints a lot of birds and he has some gorgeous results from using salt. All those beautiful feather shapes and textures were made through the use of sprinkling salt onto a wet wash. Whatever you call them, blooms, cauliflowers or backgrounds, they can be frustrating when they occur when you don't want them. But they can also be created with intention. I love them and I use them a lot in my paintings to create texture and interest. I've got a video about how to create them and how to avoid them. I'll link to it in the description. Let me show you some of the ways that I use blooms in my paintings. I had just washed in the background on this castle door painting. The paint was starting to dry and then I got my brush and dropped some water on. That disturbs the drying pigment and creates those shapes. I did the same down the front here. You get the best results when you wait until the pigment is beginning to dry. If you do it too soon, the results aren't as good. And here's the finished painting where you can see the blooms. I did the same thing here on this background wash. It was starting to dry and then I flicked some water on to create those blooms. And here's the painting finished. You can see how the blooms have created that texture in the background. And I had a bit of fun with this chicken as well. I painted on that wash, and then as it was drying, I dropped some water into the lighter area. And here she is finished. You can see that's created some texture on her feathers. When a wash is wet, it's a good time to pull out some highlights if you need them. You can use a damp brush, some scrunched up paper towel, a sponge, or even cotton buds. Again, just like creating blooms, the same thing applies with timing when you're lifting colour. If you try to lift colour when the wash is too wet, the pigment will flow back into the area where you lifted the colour and it will cover over your highlight. If you do it too late, the paint will have set and you won't be able to lift it. Here on my geranium painting, I've just painted the outside of this petal, and there are two highlights there. You'll see them on the reference photo. So I'm using my damp brush to take a bit of paint off. I make sure my brush isn't too wet, because if it's wetter than the paint that's on the paper, I risk disturbing the pigment and creating a bloom. So I've got to be careful that it's just damp enough to take the paint off, but not too wet that it will add more water to the paper. Here I'll paint some French ultramarine into my diary, and I'll use a tissue to take some paint off. You could also use paper towel or a sea sponge, even a cotton bud to take some paint off. If you were painting a sky, this is an easy way to create some clouds. Experimenting with watercolour can be really enjoyable, especially when you wet specific areas of your painting, apply a wet wash, and then tilt your paper. When you tilt the paper, you can make the paint flow in various directions, and you can have lots of fun with it. I used that technique on this seagull painting. I painted the right-hand side first and I allowed it to dry. Now I'm wetting the left-hand side, just the background. I'm making the paper quite wet because I want the paint to flow when I tilt the board. I mix up my paint colour and I paint it onto the wet paper. I'm painting it carefully against the seagull because I want to try and keep that paper white there. And then I lift my board off the table and I allow the paint to flow over the wet paper. I tilt the board in the direction I want the paint to flow. My brush gives it a helping hand. I did the same thing on the front of the seagull here, and I tilted the board the other way. I dropped the paint in and just let it flow. And here's the finished painting. So I wanted that loose, splashy background to contrast with the detail areas of the birds. If you want to have a bit of fun with your background, get some watery paint on your paper and get down low and blow through a short straw to blow the paint in all directions. I painted a kingfisher a few years ago, and because kingfishers are often found near or around water, I thought I'd paint a sort of a splashy, washy background. So I painted some blue on with my large brush, and then I got a straw and blew the paint. I was worried that I didn't have it wet enough, so I dropped a bit more water on there, which created some blooms. Then I turned my board, I got down low, and I blew the paint across the paper through the straw. I find with this you've got to get right down low level with the paint, otherwise you're just blowing on top of it. So that's something else that you can have a bit of fun with. Here's the finished painting, and you can see I've added a few blooms as well near the bird. This is really fun to do, and you can get some amazing results with it. You can put ordinary kitchen cling wrap over the top of a wet wash, let the paint dry, and then peel it off to reveal all the textural marks. This is my elephant painting that I did a few years ago, I wet the background with some water and then I painted 2 colours onto it while it was wet. And before that dried, I got some cling wrap from the kitchen. I tore off a piece of it and I placed that over the wet wash. Then I used my fingers to push and pull the cling wrap to make shapes in the wet wash. I did the same thing down the bottom. I got another piece of it, placed it onto the wet wash, and then I started to move the plastic the way I wanted it, just to create some little geometric shapes. I played with it for a little while, but I didn't want to fuss too much with it. And then after I had done that, I had to let it dry. I think I let it dry overnight because it takes a while with the plastic on top of it. And you can see all that beautiful texture that remains. I couldn't find the original elephant painting that I did. I'm not sure what I did with it. And I also did a giraffe painting using that cling wrap as the background as well. You can include other media into your artworks to help tie everything together or to add interest to your paintings. Watercolor pencils, pigment ink and gouache are all useful. I don't have a specific painting to show you where I've used watercolor pencils on a wet wash like this, but I can demonstrate in my journal. Once you've got your wash on the paper, you can use a watercolor pencil to draw in the wet wash. Try to hold the pencil loosely so that the marks you make are more relaxed and aren't too forced. The pencil makes sort of a smudgy mark in the wet wash. Another medium to combine with watercolor is ink. While that's wet, I drop in some white ink. This is Art Spectrum Pigment ink. I've not used ink like this myself on a painting, but I think it could be quite useful on loose, splashy backgrounds or landscape paintings. This is what it looked like after it had dried, which I thought was quite interesting. And you can do the same thing with gouache. Gouache is an opaque watercolour medium. This is Winsor & Newton's white gouache. I like to use it fairly thick because it dilutes with water and it fades away to virtually nothing. So if you put it on the paper while it's wet, put it on when it's fairly thick like that. And that creates some interesting organic shapes in the wet wash. I used gouache on this raven painting that I did a few years ago. I've sold the painting, so I can only show you a photo of it. But up on the head, I dropped some gouache into the black wash to add interest. I mixed some violet and some blue watercolour paint into the white gouache for that. Finally, the old trusty spray bottle is great for adding interest to a wet wash. I have this bottle that I can use if I want to squirt larger droplets onto a drying wash. I hold the trigger in and I gently squeeze to create larger droplets. And this little one here creates a really fine mist. I find it's best to wait until the wash is beginning to dry before I use these. My wash is starting to dry. Now I've got the large spray bottle. I hold it up vertically and then I gently squeeze the trigger and that releases some really large water droplets onto the drying wash. It's the same as using your wet brush to drop the water in, but the drops are a bit more random looking. And with this little one, I create a fine mist, but I was a bit too early here and nothing much is happening. So I waited a little bit longer until the paint was a bit drier. And then I did it again. This time I got some finer spray marks in the wash. There you go. Hopefully there's some inspiration there for you. There are more things that you can do with a wet wash, but there's heaps there to keep you busy, I'm sure. Success with watercolour comes from experimentation, and watercolour is the perfect medium to experiment with. It's so much fun to use. Let go of your inhibitions and have some fun with it. If you'd like to learn how to paint in watercolour or improve your existing skills, head to my website where you can find information about my online classes. While you're there, subscribe to my email newsletter and you'll gain access to a full-length watercolour tutorial of mine and also my 13-page guide to the mistakes that watercolour artists often make. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. I thought it was so exciting the way I did it.
You did do it well.
So I've got to do that again. I've got to bring it again.
No one knows.
Is that exciting enough?
And say, and Leo's right there.
You don't sprinkle wet salt, Louise. You sprinkle salt. Salt doesn't have to be wet. Is cat in the way?
Yes.
I have a little bit of especially when in various directions. Doing it again.
You can see it there.